Hello students, in this module we will be looking at the central nervous system, which has two major structures, the brain and the spinal cord. In an earlier module we looked at the structure and functions of the brain and spinal cord. We will now move back to the brain and the cerebral cortex in particular and look at the functions, which will help us in understanding the concept of localization of brain functions. Localization of brain functions refers to the theory that certain areas of the brain correspond to certain functions. In that, specific areas of the brain control different functions carried out by the brain. It refers to the idea that behavior, emotions and thoughts originate in the brain in specific locations. Let us look at the history first. The first theories localizing human intellect and experience were debated among the Greek natural philosophers, including Aristotle and Galen. During the 17th century, René Descartes argued that the brain and nervous system functioned like a machine. The brain came to be seen as made of parts, each one in a pre-assigned location, each performing a single function, so that if one of its parts were damaged, nothing could be done to replace it. Descartes' idea of the brain as a complex machine culminated in our current idea of the brain as a computer and in the localization of brain functions. In 1796, Franz Gall, a pioneer in the study of localization of brain functions, proposed the concept of phrenology. According to phrenology, the brain was not a homogeneous unit, but instead an aggregate of mental organs with specific functions. In the second half of the 19th century, a new perspective on the brain suggested that the two cerebral hemispheres were not completely equivalent in terms of function. The famous physician Paul Broca identified a number of cases where damage to the left hemisphere produced deficits in language. Broca's idea of hemispheric localization got some additional support from the German physician Karl Wernicke in 1874. Wernicke reported that damage to a certain region in the left hemisphere often resulted in a speech deficit, where patients were able to produce speech sounds that resembled fluent language, but actually were meaningless. There is a wealth of case studies on patients with damage to Broca's and Wernicke's areas that have demonstrated localization of language functions. These case studies provide evidence to support the idea that certain elements of language production and comprehension are localized in the Broca and Wernicke regions of the cerebral cortex. In 1931, Lashley propounded the equipotentiality theory that suggested that the basic motor and sensory functions are localized, but that higher mental functions are not. He claimed that intact areas of the cortex could take over responsibility for specific cognitive functions following brain injury. The equipotentiality concept and localization models led to the distributed function model of the brain, which is a compromise between the two models, as it shows both how the brain can adapt and how it can reorganize itself in the event of damage. That is to say, if a lobe is damaged, the brain can rewire itself to try and function. The main advantage of the distributed function model is that in the event of brain damage, it is possible that complete function loss may not occur as opposed to localization, which would mean that if a lobe was damaged, function could be entirely lost to that mechanism. Split brain studies and brain scan studies in the 20th century supported the distributed function model. In 1989, Tulving found that participants in a study of memory, the prefrontal cortex was used predominantly to try to remember episodic memories, whereas semantic memory showed high levels of activity towards the back of the cortex. Understanding brain function and functional localization had crude beginnings, but this early understanding laid the foundation for brain research in the modern era. Now, let us look at the 4 brain lobes. As we learnt earlier, each hemisphere of the cerebral cortex can be broken down into 4 functionally and spatially defined lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal and occipital. Localization of brain functions is described following these 4 cerebral lobes. The frontal cortex is responsible for the processing of information from diverse and very widely separated regions of the rest of the cortex. It is a complex integration center that defines an individual's personality more than any other region of the brain. It creates an awareness of the self in relation to the world and enables us to plan and execute actions into the future. The frontal lobe is located at the front of the brain over the eyes. It also contains the motor cortex, which is important for planning and implementing movement. It is mostly involved in the control of voluntary muscles, intelligence and personality, motor behavior, expressive language, ability to concentrate and attend, reasoning and thinking, and orientation to time, place and person. An important part of the frontal lobes is the prefrontal cortex, which primarily deals with higher order thinking, such as personality and processing primary motor and sensory data. It is often called the executive control system because of its role in monitoring and organizing thinking. Deficiencies and damage in the frontal cortex compromise the ability of an individual to make sensible predictions about the future, consequences of events and actions in the present. Although intellectual power may be left unaltered, normal restraints on interpersonal discourse are seriously affected by frontal damage. Much of what makes us human, civilized and creative resides in this part of the brain. The parietal lobe is located at the top and toward the rear of the head. 2 main functions of the parietal lobes are processing somatosensation, that is touch, pressure, pain, heat and cold, and proprioception, that is the sense of how parts of the body are oriented in space. All the body sensations are projected in the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe is located at the base of the brain by the ears. It is primarily involved in hearing, language processing, emotions and memory. It also contains the hippocampus, which processes memory formation. The auditory cortex located in the temporal lobe is responsible for auditory processes. The process starts at the cochlea, which detects sound and then transports messages to the brain stem for basic processing, then onto the auditory cortex. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the brain and responds to visual stimuli. It is primarily involved in vision, seeing, recognizing and identifying the visual world. It has been estimated that about 50% of the cerebral cortex is devoted to visual processing. Nerve impulses are transferred from the retina to the visual cortex via optic nerves. The retina, which is the crucial organ of the eye, is connected with it. Hence, if one of the optic nerves is damaged, either of the eyes will lose its visual ability. Visual hallucination is also found in patients with occipital epilepsy. Total destruction of the occipital cortex results in cortical blindness. Other subtle dysfunctions are distortion of images and loss of depth perception. Apart from the 4 lobes, 2 other important regions of the cerebral cortex are the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex. The somatosensory cortex processes information about body sensations relating to touch, pressure, pain and temperature. It is located in front of the parietal lobes. The motor cortex, just behind the frontal lobes, processes information about voluntary movement of various parts of the body like leg, arm and face. The premotor cortex controls complex muscular movements of the body. Each hemisphere is connected with the opposite side of the body. If the motor area of the left hemisphere is damaged or destroyed, the right limbs are paralyzed and vice versa. Patients with damage to the motor areas often suffer from apraxia, which is an inability to carry out voluntary movements. Now that we have looked at the four lobes, let us look a little more in detail about the language areas in the cerebral cortex. There are two areas in the left hemisphere that play an important role in understanding and producing language. Broca's area, where language is produced, and Wernicke's area, where language is comprehended. Broca's area, located in the frontal lobe, is the primary brain center for controlling and producing speech. Wernicke's area, located in the temporal lobe, is involved in interpreting sounds, particularly the sound of human speech, and is responsible for speech perception. The Wernicke's area receives sound impulses and processes its meanings. These messages travel to the Broca's area where sounds are assembled, then to the motor cortex which sends signals to the speech muscles. Damage to these two language areas causes aphasia, an impairment of language. It affects a person's ability to communicate, affecting the production or comprehension of speech and the ability to read or write. Aphasia is most often caused by strokes in the left side of the brain that control speech and language. The type of aphasia depends on the part of the brain which has been affected. People who have been injured in the critical Broca's area typically have trouble articulating the right words to describe things, even though their comprehension of what they hear or read is unaffected. In other words, such people are fully able to understand but unable to communicate what they have understood. This condition is called motor or expressive aphasia. Those with damage to Wernicke's area are unable to comprehend language but can still speak fluently. This leads to a condition known as receptive aphasia. None of the four lobes which we talked about earlier is devoted exclusively to the processes described so far. Large areas within each lobe are called association areas, which link sensory and motor processing. Embedded in the brain's lobes, the association cortices make up 75% of the cerebral cortex. Association areas integrate or organize different kinds of sensory information to produce appropriate behavior. The essential function of these areas is to respond to immediate sense impressions and symbols and integrate all the information. Because of these areas, we are able to correlate all our present experiences with past experiences and make use of memory and thought processes. It is also involved in linguistic and perceptual functioning. The highest intellectual functions such as thinking, complex planning and problem solving occur in the frontal association area. Thus, we can see that the cortex is where our memories are stored, where we make decisions, where we see a sunset or recognize and appreciate a melody, and where we organize our worlds and plan for the future. Without a cortex, we would cease to exist as unique functioning individuals. The cerebral cortex functions like an executive, interpreting incoming information and making decisions about how to respond. As we go about our daily lives, our cerebral cortices constantly analyze a vast array of incoming messages, evaluate them against stored information about past experiences, and then make decisions that are translated into messages that are sent to appropriate muscles and glands. A useful generalization about how the brain functions is that the back half, the parietal, occipital and back part of the temporal lobes, takes in and perceives the world, while the front half integrates this information, analyzes it, decides what to do, then plans and executes the decision. A better understanding of how the brain works will give us all a better way to get a handle on who we are and how we can take an active hand in shaping our lives. Every brain is different and no brain is perfect. It is our responsibility to learn about ourselves and about what gives us each a unique way of seeing the world. The human brain is the most complicated organ in the universe. It is involved in everything you do. When your brain works right, you work right. When your brain is troubled, it is hard to be your best self. We also must know that brain injuries can change a person's whole life. So, in conclusion, I would say, respect and protect your brain. Here is a case study which will explain Broca's area. When he was 30 years old, Louis-Victor Le Bon lost the ability to speak or speak in any matter that made any sort of sense. Upon being admitted to a suburban Paris hospital that specialized in mental illness, he could utter only a single syllable, tan. That syllable came with expressive hand gestures and varying pitch and inflection, to be sure, but it was the only syllable he could pronounce. By the time he arrived at the hospital, he had been unable to speak properly for some 2 to 3 months, and even though his family thought the condition might be temporary, he would remain there until his death 21 years later. Apart from his inability to speak, Louis-Victor did not appear to exhibit any signs of physical or cognitive trauma. His intelligence seemed unaffected, his mental and physical faculties intact and responsive. He appeared to grasp everything he was asked and did his best to respond in a meaningful fashion. Though tan, usually spoken twice, tan, remained the only thing he could say, he never stopped trying to communicate. Within 10 years, however, Le Bon began to manifest other signs of distress. First, his right arm became paralyzed, soon his right leg followed suit. His vision deteriorated and his mental faculties as well. It got to the point where patient Tan, as he came to be called, refused to get out of bed, and he remained that way for over 7 years. In April 1861, Le Bon developed gangrene. His entire right side had become inflamed and he could hardly move. He was then admitted to surgery, and there he met for the first time a French physician, Pierre-Paul Broca. Broca specialized in study of language. Le Bon intrigued him. Gangrene aside, he decided to test the patient's faculties to see if he couldn't determine the extent of his condition. It was tricky business. Le Bon was right-handed. Not only could he not speak, but he couldn't write. Communication would prove difficult. Le Bon could, however, gesture with his left hand, and while many of his gestures were incomprehensible, when it came to numbers, he retained a surprising amount of control. He could tell the time on a watch to the second. He knew how long he had been at the hospital. His faculties had indeed degraded, but in some ways he remained as sharp as ever. When it came to speech, however, Broca's main area of interest, Le Bon was hopelessly lost. As Broca would later describe his condition, he could no longer produce but a single syllable which he usually repeated twice in succession, regardless of the question asked him, he always responded tan combined with various expressive gestures. That is why throughout the hospital he is known only by the name Tan. Broca termed this deficit aphasia, the loss of articulated speech. So, in this module we looked at many theories which supported the localization of brain functions, but also at certain other theories which tried to show that localization of brain functions was not something which was fixed. We looked at the 4 lobes of the brain which is used to describe the localization of brain functions, and we looked specifically at certain language areas which support the theory of the localization of brain functions.